Hi, my name is Lisa Claxton, and today we'll be learning the Ionic column earrings. In this class, you're going to learn the basic techniques of looping, spiraling, forming a wire structure, and wire weaving. I hope you enjoy today's class. These are the tools we'll be using in today's class. I have a round nose plier, I have a chain nose plier, a nylon jaw wire straightener, a ruler, and fine tip flush cutters. These are the materials we'll be using in today's project. I have 10 sterling silver head pins, a pair of sterling silver ear wires. I have an assortment here, it's about 10 4mm daisy spacers. I also have a collection of different stones. You'll need at least 10, but on this piece I've added 6 of a different style to just help accent my center drops. I'm also using 6 feet of 26 gauge fine silver wire and 3 feet of 20 gauge sterling silver wire. A note about your 20 gauge wire. It's easiest to work with wire that's half hard as it holds up better while you're weaving. Most of us have 20 gauge dead soft in our collections. So rather than have to buy a special wire, I like to use my nylon jaw wire straightener to harden the wire. So to straighten and harden your 20 gauge wire, I'm going to hold the end of the wire in my chain nose pliers, and I'm just going to gently grab on with my wire straighteners, and I'm going to pull on the length of my wire, and you'll notice I'm holding my wire straighteners at a bit of an angle. And I'm going to do this several times, and I can switch the angle. And you'll notice my wire, when I let go, is becoming springy, and this means the wire is hardening. The frame of our weaving structure consists of 5 pieces of the 20 gauge wire, 4 of which will have spirals on the end. For the next step, you'll need to cut 5 pieces that measure 3 inches each using your 20 gauge wire. If you need to, you can harden the wire just a little bit with your nylon jaw wire straightener. So to make spirals on the end of your 20 gauge wire, you're going to use your round nose pliers. We want to make as small of a loop as we can to begin. So I'm just going to grab onto the very end of my 20 gauge toward the tip of my tool. You'll know I'm right on the very end. There's no wire sticking through. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start by making a half a loop. Now, something to note about making spirals. I like to leave a little space in the center of my spiral. In order to make it spiral properly, I'm going to need to smash down the very tip of my 20 gauge wire. And to do this, I'm just going to put that half loop back into my pliers. And at the very tip, I'm going to squeeze my tool. And what that's going to do is it's just going to smash down the very end of this loop. And it's going to make for a nicer spiral. So if you look close, you'll see the very end of the wire has been smoothed down to a point. I'm now ready to continue making the spiral, so I can put my round nose back in. And I'm going to continue making this loop. And as I finish the loop, I'm going to go about a half a turn. So you'll see that the wire is building up along the side of the original loop. So I now have about a loop and a half. This is as far as I can go using my round nose pliers. So I'm going to put those down, and I'm going to pick up my chain nose plier, and I'm going to just grab on to half of the spiral, I like to grab in the back of my chain nose plier. I find that it doesn't mar the wire quite as much if you grab further back in the jaws. And now what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be pushing the length of my wire up against the side of my existing spiral. And I can go about a quarter turn, and then I'll have to adjust my plier. So just open it up, take that spiral out, reposition, push up against the side. And I can continue this until I've reached my desired spiral length. When working on a project where you're using lots of spirals that you want to be the same size, one way of ensuring that is using a ruler. What you can do is take your 20 gauge and measure out a determined length. Many times I'll pull out my copper wire, I'll make a measurement, and then I'll do a spiral and decide, is that the size spiral I want? In this case, we're just going to go for a 1/2 inch. And what I'm doing is I've measured out 1/2 inch, and then I bent the wire up against the edge of my ruler. If you find that when you make your spirals you tend to smash them with your chain nose pliers, you can do a quick fix to that. What I do is I use a little bit of painter's tape, and I'm just going to go ahead and apply it to my tool, the tooth of my tool, top and bottom. And what this will do is this will soften the teeth of my tool so no metal will actually touch my spiral. So now I can continue with the same technique where I grab onto my spiral and I'm going to push the wire up against the sides of my spiral until I have my desired spiral length. And you'll notice with that there's no marring or scratching on the wire that makes up the spiral. To make your first earring, you're going to want to go ahead and spiral up 4 pieces of your 3-inch wire. You'll notice the size of the spirals. They spiral around so that the wire is doubled over 2 times. Notice the placement of the very tip of each spiral. They're all right down here at the bottom. To verify that your spirals are the same size, you can always take 2 of them and just line them up side by side to make sure that no one is bigger than the other. I'm now ready to begin weaving my earring. I'm going to start by picking up my 3-inch length of 20 gauge wire that has no spiral on it. I'm also holding on to my 26 gauge wire. This is about 2.5 feet long. I'm going to connect the 26 gauge wire to the 20 gauge wire just by making 5 simple coil wire wraps. When I'm doing so few coils, I like to just work with a short tail of the 26 gauge wire. So I'm just going to hold the 2 together and begin to wrap. Things to keep in mind is it doesn't matter where on your 20 gauge wire you begin coiling, as we're just making a tube, so it's easily adjustable and you can slide it up and down. Also, your first couple wraps of your coil are the easiest ones to take out, so when you're making the coil, if your first few wraps are bad, don't worry about it, we can just pull those out. So I'm now going to do my coiling. So I have 1 good one, there's 2, 3, 4, and 5. Now I have a little tail of wire left over. I'm going to go ahead and keep that on, as at the very end of my design I may decide that I want more coils than that, and I'll have a little extra wire to do that change in design. I'm now ready to add my first 2 pieces of my coiled spiraled wire. So I have my 5 wraps here, and I tidied up that coil so it all looks nice and neat. And when I weave, which is what I'll be doing as I incorporate these new wires, is my 26 gauge wire will be wrapping over and under, alternating between each of my 20 gauge wires. So I start from the middle, And I'm just going to hold my wire so it's coming straight up from the middle of my 20 gauge. And I'm going to pick up my first spiraled wire and I'm going to hold it right next to my 20 gauge wire. And you'll remember earlier when we were coiling, I said it doesn't matter where you begin. It's the same with our coils. I could always start a little further away from that spiral and then later on push the spiral down into place. I find I like to work with it a little ways away so that way the spiral doesn't get in my way as I weave. So to incorporate my new spiraled wire, I'm just going to hold it in place. And I'm going to take my 26 gauge wire and I'm going to wrap it around the outside edge. And I'm going to need to bring it in between the two wires. And I'm really going to get my fingers in there. I'm going to get that outside wrap nice and tight. So now the wire is going over the outside wire and then underneath and between these two. And I can now bring my 26 gauge wire over the middle. At this time, I'm now ready to add my second coiled wire, spiraled wire on the side. So I'm going to pick that up. I'm going to hold it in place. And I'm going to bring the wire around the outside edge. And now I need to go in between that outside wire and my middle wire. So I'm going to feed the wire through and I'm going to bring it down. I'm going to do several rows here for you so you can see this happen over and over again. In the beginning it can be a little confusing because it's hard to see which wire is which. Some tricks you can do for yourself is you could always mark the end of the wire using a Sharpie, as it will just rub off. So if I want to mark the center wire, I can just incorporate some little black marks onto that center wire. So as I'm weaving, I'll be able to see the distinction between my outside wires and my center wire. So from a different angle, you can really see that weave starting to take shape. I'm going to continue weaving a couple more rows for you. I'm going to take my 26 gauge wire. It's going to come in between. And I really need to get in here and tighten it. And what I'm doing is I'm pulling on the wire. Now I'm going to take it in between. And again, I'm going to shape it. So this puts a lot of pressure on your thumbnail here, shaping your wire. Now I'm going to wrap around the outside edge. And I'm going to shape it. I'll come up from the middle. And I'm going to shape it. Wrap around the outside edge. Now I'm just going to continue this process until I have 6 wires wrapping around the outside edges. So you'll see on this side so far I have 3, and on my other side I'm now up to 4 wires. So I want to keep weaving until I have 6 wires wrapping around the outside on both sides. We now have 6 wires wrapping around the outside on both sides of our piece. That means we're ready to add our next 2 spiraled pieces of 20 gauge wire. You'll notice that my spirals aren't right up against the weaving. At the very end of the piece, I'm going to pull on these wires and that will pull them into position. So I'm going to add my next segments of the 20 gauge wire in the same manner that I added the first 2. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up a new piece and I'm going to hold it right where I need it to go, right on the side, and I'm going to wrap it around the outside edge, and I want to get this nice and tight, so it's worth spending the time you need to get a nice tight wrap And I'm going to wrap all the way around it. And now I'm just going to go across the row until I get to the other side, and I can add my next side. Now, one thing to note here is you'll notice at the end my wires are kind of getting confusing. I have a lot of wires here. You can slightly bend. This is the wire I just put on. I'm going to slightly bend this outward. I don't want to bend it too far because I don't want my weaving structure to get wider as I go along. But if I just bend the tip out a little bit, it'll make it easier for me when I'm weaving so I can identify what wire that is. I could also use my Sharpie and make little black marks on the end of these two new wires I'm adding, so it'll make it a little bit clearer for me what I'm doing. So I'm going to weave across the row, tightening every single stitch. And now I'm at the other side. I'm going to go ahead and add my next piece, and I'm just going to hold it right on the side, and I'm going to wrap it tight around the edge. I'm going to wrap around it all the way one time, and I'm going to continue across. One thing you'll notice is that the wire I've just put on the opposite side is dangling free. It's one of the hardest parts about working on this piece is holding all our wires together. A good trick to help you hold it is to use your nylon jaw wire straighteners and actually grab onto your piece and the spirals themselves and hold your piece like so. This will make it a little bit easier to hold on, and it'll keep that original wire that I just put on from falling off. It usually only takes a couple rows until it's held tightly in place, and you don't need to do this. So I'm going to go ahead and continue weaving. I'm going to pull that one I just put, I'm going to pull it out just a little bit. And the black on that center wire makes it easy for me to see where I'm going with this. And I'm continuing the pattern of over and under, over and under. So now I've wrapped around about 2 times. And that should help those outside wires hold into place. So let me tighten this very last one and we'll take a look at it. You can really see the pattern starting to form. Now when you're weaving, the length of your wire can make it difficult. Oftentimes, I find it's easier if I just have a short length of wire to weave onto. So what I'll often do is I'll actually pull on these 20 gauge wires, and what I'm doing is I'm making my tails just a little bit shorter. Now I want to be careful here. I don't want to pull it out completely by accident. So if I shorten each of these wires just a little bit, you'll see now on my other end where I'm weaving, I now have a little bit more of a manageable length. If I wanted to, I could always shorten them significantly. This includes the center wire. So now it's gotten much clearer with just a few wires, shorter length. I can really see what I'm doing. I'm going to continue weaving about 1 inch, all 5 of the wires. I really want to keep the edges tight. You'll see here I have one that's a little bit loose. That first one I did, and you can see how it does stand out. So as I'm working the piece, I do want to put some focus on the edges of my piece to keep it nice and tidy. splay my wires a little bit more so I can see, and I'll continue the weave. So you can now see that I have several rows complete with all 5 of my wires. Once I finish my weaving, I'll be able to push down these original wires. But as I continue to weave, one thing I want to watch out for are those black marks I made on my wire. We can see right here in the very center, there's a spot where I marked my 20 gauge wire with a Sharpie. I do want to make sure I remove that before I weave over it. So I'm just going to pull it down. And oftentimes with the Sharpie, you can just rub your finger on it, and that'll remove the ink for you. If it doesn't, just a little bit of rubbing alcohol will almost always take it off completely. For this particular earring design, I like to weave so that I have 22 wraps on each side of my piece. So continue weaving in the same manner until you count 22 wires going down each of the sides. We've now done about 22 rows. So we have 22 coming down each side. If I wanted to make an earring that was shorter or longer, I could always adjust this middle amount of weaving. 1 inch is usually the longest you want to go, especially if making an earring. So we're now ready to tidy up our piece. The first thing you'll notice, I've wiped off all of my Sharpie marks. So I have nice clean wire. And I'm now ready to push these spirals down into place so that they'll tuck right up against the edge of my weaving. And to do this, I'm just going to pick up my chain nose pliers, and I'm going to grab on to the very end of my wire. I'm grabbing onto the outside edge, so I'm going to be pulling this first spiral right up against the weaving, and I'm just gently going to tug on it, and it should just slide right down. Now I'm going to grab onto my next wire, and I'm going to do the same thing. And then I'm going to come over to my other side, grab onto that outside wire, get it nice and snug, and one last spiral to bring down into place. So you'll now see it's tucked. Each of the spirals are right up against the weaving. Now I'm ready to finish off my piece. In order to do that, I'm going to want to step the weaving just like I did in the beginning. You'll notice how we only have 3 wires here that have about 12 rows of weaving, so 6 loops on each outside edge. I want to repeat that down at the bottom. So to do that, you're just going to continue your weaving, only this time you're going to avoid wrapping the 2 outside edge wires. So I can push those out of my way. So now I'm just weaving on the center 3 wires. Get it nice and tight. And I want the bottom of my piece to match the top of my piece. So how many ever wraps I did here at the top, I want to match at the bottom. So I'm going to continue weaving until I count 6 wires on each of the outside wires. So I'm looking for 6 loops. So I now have 6 loops on each of my outside wires down here at the bottom. And to finish off, I want to just repeat what I have up at the top. I made 5 coils with my wire on the center wire, and I'm going to want to repeat that. So I'm going to weave until I'm in the middle of a row, and now I'm just going to coil the wire nice and tight just around my middle wire. So I'm coiling the 26 gauge around that middle wire, and I'm going to repeat by doing 5 coils just as I have on the top. So now to finish this piece, we can go ahead and cut off the tails of the 26 gauge wire. If I wanted to add beads up here, I always could do that. I do like having the 5 coils though. I feel like once I make a loop on the top, it'll be a good place to hang the ear wire. With these tails, you could add more coils if desired. So I'm going to go with the 5 and go ahead and trim each of my wires. And I like to find a front and a back on each piece. So if this is my front, and here's my bottom wire, I'm going to go ahead and bring it around to the back so I can cut the wire in the back. This way, when you look at the front of my piece, you won't see any place where the wire has ended. The main way that I determine what's front and back is mistakes. If I have mistakes on one side, I'm going to make that the back side. So on this particular piece, I had a little extra space in some of my loops, and so I went ahead and chose this to be the back side of my piece. And before I finish, you'll also notice that my piece is a little bit wobbly. It's not nice and flat. So I'm going to go ahead and flatten it out just by using my nylon jaw wire straighteners. And I'm just going to come in here and flatten the piece. So I'm just grabbing onto it, and I'm using a little bit of pressure with my hands to help flatten out all the stitches. And if I need to, if I feel like it's really twisting around, I can always go in at a different angle with my wire straighteners, really, and try and flatten this out. And you'll notice that helped quite a bit from flattening my piece out. Oh, and you'll also notice down here at the bottom, I have a little bit of gap that happened. That's not going to be a problem because I'll be able to just push that weave up. Make it nice and tight, and you'll notice that gap disappeared. Now, if when you finish your weaving there's a lot of loose rows, or your weaving itself has scooted down quite a bit, and you try to push it up with your fingers, but your fingers are tired from all the weaving you've done, you can use your tools to help tighten all your weaving rows. To do this, just use your chain nose pliers and grab onto the very bottom of all 5 of your wires. And I'm grabbing onto the bottom of the wire, so that way I'm not risking marring any of the wire up here where I'll be making loops. And now I'm going to pick up my wire straighteners, and I'm going to be pulling down with my chain nose just a little bit, but pushing up against the weaving with my wire straighteners. That one's slipped, so I can just pull that one down. Grab onto the 5 wires again and push up against the weaving. If I need to, if some of my loops up here at the top, the spirals have shifted, I can also use this technique with my wire straightener in place up against the weaving to just grab onto the end of each wire individually and pull it down. This will help tighten your whole piece. You'll notice how those spirals are just tucking into the weaving, nice and tight. So now I have very little space in between each one, and it's tightened up all the weaving rows. To complete the earring, we finish each of our 20 gauge wires with a simple loop. My next step will be go ahead and cut down those 20 gauge wires and make my loops. Do notice the positioning of the loops on the finished piece. The only loop that's completely centered is the center wire. The other 4 loops all loop upward and kind of stick off to the side. I'm now ready to cut off each of my 20 gauge wires. Before I do that, I'm going to grab onto my piece, and using my chain nose pliers, I'm going to grab onto the 20 gauge wire. I'm going to start with the outside one, and I'm just going to pull it outward, almost a 90-degree angle. I'll flip the piece over, I'll do my other outside wire. Then I'm going to go ahead and do my next wires. And I'm going to leave that center wire alone. Now I'm ready to go ahead and cut down each of these wires. So I'm just going to pick up my wire cutters. And the size of loop is really determined by you. I tend to just guesstimate. I would always rather guesstimate so that my wire is a little bit too long and I need to cut some off than to cut it so that it's too short. So in this case, I'm a little over 1/4 inch. I'm going to go ahead and trim. Now if you want to make certain that each of your wires are the exact same size, so your loops will be the same, you can take a piece of wire, this is the scrap I just cut off, and I can measure it to the length of wire I have left. And usually the easiest way to do this is I'm then going to snip it right at that spot. So I know I'm going to cut all of my 20 gauge wires to this exact length. So now what I can do is just line up that little wire scrap with my next 20 gauge wire, and it shows me exactly where I need to cut. And I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. I'm going to line up my little scrap wire. And I'm going to go in here and I'm going to cut. The most important thing about your loops is that they're consistent in size. So whether it's a big loop or a small loop doesn't matter. What matters is that your wire is all the same length. Now at this point, my 20 gauge wire is running the length of my piece. So rather than cut it, I can always just pull my 20 gauge. I'm going to use my chain nose so I can get a better grip. I want to be careful here though. I don't want to pull the 20 gauge wire out of the earring completely. I just want to pull it just a little bit. If this part scares you, you might want to go ahead and just cut off your 20 gauge rather than try to pull it. I always get nervous at this point. So you'll see I pulled it a little bit too short. It's not a problem because it didn't come out. Had I pulled just a little bit more, it would have come loose. And then I would have had a little sad moment. So I'm going to go ahead and make this so that this wire is the same length as the little scrap I've been working with. And I see it's a little bit longer, and at this point I'm just going to cut it off. So now each of my wires should be about the same length. Our next step is to finish off making the loops on our bottom 5 ends, and then also to cut down the top and make our final loop. I begin by using my round nose pliers, and I'm just going to start on the outside ones first. I'm going to grab on with my round nose plier so that there's right on the very tip of the wire, so there's no wire sticking out on the second side. And now I'm going to roll while holding the piece. I'm going to roll this wire up to make my loop. Now I can already tell that where I grabbed on my pliers, that's going to be too big of a loop. I'm going to run out of wire. So to correct that, I was originally right here. I can just pull my pliers back toward the end of the jaw of the tool, grab onto the very end of the wire again, and just kind of work it to a tighter loop. Now I'll continue to roll, so I'll get my first loop. To make this easier for my next loops, I can use my Sharpie pen to just mark my round nose plier right where I needed to grab on. By making this mark, I'll know for all my other loops that I need to grab just above where the mark is on my tool. So I can go ahead and go to my next loop. I'm going to grab just above where that mark on my tool is, and I'm going to roll my next loop. I can flip it over and do the same to my other 2 wires. I'll grab just where my mark is, the very end of the wire, and I'll roll until my loop touches. And I'll repeat on my final side wire. I can now finish off my bottom loop. Now this one, I want to start by making a right angle. This loop is going to be centered, and I'm going to be making a right angle right up against my coil. You don't have to worry about which direction you're making this loop, as the piece itself will spin. So whichever direction is easiest for you, at the very end we can then place our loop open face. So I'm going to build it at a right angle to what I originally wanted at. So I'm going to put my thumbnail right up against the coil, grabbing onto the end of the wire with my chain nose plier, and I'm going to bend a right angle. And now I can grab on with my round nose pliers right up above the line that I made, and I'm going to make my final loop. Now you'll see when I made the loop here, I have a little bit extra wire. That's not a problem. I can easily fix that. I'm just going to pick up my wire cutters, and I'm going to just trim off just a tiny bit of wire. I would always rather cut too little of wire and have to cut again than cut too much and end up with a loop that's too small. I'll just trim off a little extra wire, pick my round nose pliers up again, grab onto the loop, and gently continue making my loop. And now I can turn it. So I've now completed the bottom of my earring. I'm now ready to finish my final loop. To finish the final loop, I'm going to make a right angle against the coil. Now in this case, it's much easier to make a loop that isn't going against the spiral. So you'll notice the bottom loop that I made, I'm going to turn this one sideways. So that way I'm able, since they're connected, I'm able to make a loop sideways up on the top loop, and when I turn this, it will turn the final loop in the correct position. So I've turned it sideways. Now I'm going to come up to the top, and I'm going to bend a right angle using my thumbnail working against the top of the coil. I saved my little scrap wire that I used to bend or to cut my lengths down here at these bottom loops. So I'm going to line that up the same way I did before. And I'm going to go ahead and cut this wire down to size. And now I'm going to make my loop. So I'm going to grab on with my round nose pliers, and I'm going to turn my loop, and I can tell right now I'm going to have extra wire. So you'll see here I ended up with much too much wire. So again, it's not a problem. I can just pick up my chain nose. Oops, sorry, my wire cutters. And I'm going to come in here, and I know I need to cut off a lot of wire, so I'm going to cut about half of that loop off. And I'm going to start the whole process again by picking up my round nose pliers. I'm going to grab on, and I'm going to continue turning that loop. There's my final loop. Here's my piece. And now I can just turn my center wire so that everything lines up just right. One of our final steps to this piece is adding our embellishment. I lay out all the beads on the head pins as I'd like them to hang off of the piece. And then I'm just going to pick up each head pin, and I'm going to bend the wire to a right angle against the top of the bead. And I'm going to do this on each of my pieces. After I've bent the right angle, I'm then going to go ahead and cut down the wire, and then I'll make my loop. Now that I've bent a right angle on top of each bead, I can go ahead and trim down the excess wire on each head pin. So I'm going to pick up my wire cutters, and I'm going to go ahead and trim off. The amount that I cut off depends on the size loop that I prefer. I kind of have an unwritten size I always go for. This is a little bit less than 1/4 of an inch, and I'll go ahead and trim that off. Now the biggest thing about doing our loops on head pins is we want all of our loops to be the same length. So what I can do is I can save this little scrap of wire, and again I can use this as my guide. So any head pin that uses the same amount of beads, in this case I just have one bead, I can pick up the match, and I can use this wire as my guide. So I'm going to line up end to end, and I can see right where I need to cut my wire. Now my other head pins, those use more beads. So I'm going to need to make sure that I don't use my original wire guide, as the head pin requires more wire for the additional bead. To match this one up to my first two, I can actually just pick up one of my pieces and try to line them up as best I can. And this should show me where I need to make my cut. And I can save this new scrap of wire for all the head pins I have. In this case I have 3 total that have 3 beads on them. And I'm going to go ahead and cut those. So now we're ready to make the loops on our head pins. You're going to need your round nose pliers. And you're going to pick up your first head pin with the bead strung on. And this is the same way we've made loops throughout the piece. You're going to grab onto the very end of the wire so that none of it's sticking out of the second side. And you're just going to roll toward your bead. At some point, you're not going to be able to continue rolling, so you may need to loosen your grip, pull back on the wire, and continue to roll that loop until it closes tight. You're now going to do this on each of your head pins. We're now going to connect our head pins to our earring. I prefer not to open the links on the component itself. Rather, I prefer to open the loops on the head pins. So I'm going to just pick up my first one. I'm going to use my chain nose pliers to open the loop. I'm going to pick up my component. I'm going to go ahead and string that loop on. Let me open that up a little more. String it on, and then close the loop of my head pin. I now have my first embellishment. Now that all of the embellishment has been put on, we're now ready to put on the final touch, our ear wire. To put on the ear wire, you're going to use your chain nose pliers, and you're going to pick up your piece, and I'm going to open the loop on my earring, this top loop. So I'm gently going to grab on to the side of the loop with my chain nose pliers and open it up. I can now pick up my earring finding, and I'm going to slide that on. This is a time where I'm going to think about what was my front and what is the back of my earring. So I want to make sure I string this on correctly. Once the ear wire is on, I can then close the loop. And I now have my finished earring. We've now completed our earring. You'll make a second one to match. Here I have a sample of 2 earrings. This is the one we made during class, and this is one that I made previously. You'll notice the difference of the detail in wire on the ruby pair of earrings. This was due to the fact that I patinaed the wire using liver of sulfur and used a polishing cloth to brighten up all the highlights. Using patina on silver wire when you're weaving really gives you nice detail to the work that you've done. And you'll notice that the 2 pieces have a very different finished look. When making a pair of earrings, it's important to make the 2 pieces as symmetrical as possible. Oftentimes you can just do your first piece and then repeat the process and make your second earring. If, however, you have problems with your loops being different sizes or the spirals being different sizes, you can design the 2 pieces simultaneously. I would start by making the spirals on the end of my 20 gauge on all 8 pieces of wire, 4 for each earring. That way my spirals will be all the same. Then I'll begin my weaving first on one piece, and then I'll go ahead and work it on the second piece. This ensures that your tension of weaving on both pieces will be the same since you work them at the same time. After finishing the weaving, I'll then go ahead and cut the wire on the ends on both pieces. Then I'll make my loops, again on both pieces, and then I'll finally attach the head pins on both pieces. Doing it this way ensures that both earrings will match. Here are 2 variations of the design we made in today's class. You'll notice this first piece here uses the same number of wires, but it's significantly shorter, and there are spirals on both the top and the bottom. This makes for a great link in a necklace or in a bracelet. Over here I have another piece that's made the same way, spirals on the top and on the bottom, but you'll notice if you count the number of spirals that there are 7 wires wide as opposed to the 5 of the design we worked up today. This also works great as a link, and it's a little bit larger, so it holds up better if you were going to mix heavy beads on either side with wire wrapping to connect your links. When making a link that's this larger size, 7 wires wide and also long, sometimes it's nice for it to have a little bit of curve so it will fit around your wrist. To do this, you can use nylon jaw bracelet bending pliers. This is similar to your wire straightener, as in that it has a nylon jaw, but it also has a slight curve on the jaw. That curve will curve our piece. To do this, simply grab onto your piece, and with just a little bit of pressure, the pliers will begin to bend your piece. And I'm going to do it first in the middle, then I'm going to work my way toward each end. I want to make sure to get those spirals involved. I'm going to do this on both sides. And this is just going to give me a very slight curve. So you'll now see on the piece, I have just a little bit of curve to it. And this is going to fit really nicely going around the wrist. You're also able to do this with your earrings. Rather than have a straight piece, if you just wanted them to slightly curve backwards, you can use, again, the nylon jaw bracelet bending pliers. In this case, they'll be earring bending pliers. And I'm going to do the same thing I did with my larger link. Just apply gentle pressure with the pliers. And you'll see how it's starting to curve my piece. And now I just have a slight curve. So when I wear my earrings, they'll gently be going back toward the hairline and give me just a little bit different of a look. Hi, thanks for being part of Beaducation and the Ionic column earrings class. When making your piece, if there's little imperfections between your 2 separate earrings, don't worry, because when you wear them, they're always going to be a face apart. Enjoy!